What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And it's that time of year where we start to speak about Halloween crimes. So today, we are going to talk about an unthinkable crime that occurred on Halloween night back in 1984. Halloween is a prime time for criminal activity, and several crimes in particular see higher rates just due to the atmosphere of Halloween and the behavior it encourages. People seem to feel emboldened in costumes wandering the streets, and they use the bustle to get away with the worst. It's like our yearly mellowed out version of the purge. But most crime rate increases are for things like car accidents due to drunk driving or property crimes like vandalism and obviously disorderly conduct. Only the worst of the worst take this opportunity to murder. And that is exactly what we will be speaking about today. This is going to be an incredibly difficult video. It is brutal. It is very graphic. It involves the loss of a child. So proceed with caution. We're going to be talking about the brutal slaying of 31-year-old Doreen Erbert and her unborn son in front of her own daughter on Halloween night by a man she referred to as the Big Bad Wolf. So let's get into the details. Doreen Erbert was born in Santa Rosa, California in 1952 to a loving family. Her upbringing was described as being supportive and peaceful, and it led to Doreen having the most compassionate demeanor. Her husband at the time of her death, Charles, said, quote, "She was an angel. When she smiled and laughed, you couldn't help not loving her. She was always so giving." Her compassionate heart led her to a career as a physical therapist. She loved to help people, and she ultimately landed a job in the San Francisco Bay Area. She was happy. She was doing well in her career, and she even set her eyes on a love interest. Michael Dennis, who went by Mike, was a sprayer at the next door Lockheed factory. I'm unsure exactly how they met. It might have just been close proximity and running into each other, but regardless, Doreen and Mike hit it off. Mike hadn't had the easiest life up to this point. He had suffered from hearing loss as a child, and this led to a stutter that often left him to himself. Not only was he embarrassed about his stutter, but at the time he was also wearing a hearing aid, and they weren't small, inconspicuous earpieces at this point in time. It was a massive piece of equipment that he had to keep in his pocket, connected to a large earpiece by a wire. So he struggled socially. He was embarrassed, he was self-conscious, he never had a girlfriend, and this left him falling into a deep depression for most of his life. At this point, he had all but succumbed to the idea that he was going to be lonely and sad for the rest of his life. He started to struggle with his weight due to an eating disorder, but then in walked Doreen like a ray of sunshine. Doreen loved him for who he was. She helped him through his struggles. She accepted him no matter what. And according to those that knew Mike best, he was giddy and said that Doreen was the one that he had always been hoping for. So after just a few short months of dating, the couple married in 1975. And on April 17th the following year, their son Paul was welcomed into the world. Paul was everything to Doreen and Mike. He was a little copy paste of the two of them, and he was like the little built-in buddy that Mike had always wished to have. People were always in and out of his life, but now he had the unconditional love of his son. But unfortunately, the couple's relationship started to fizzle out about as quickly as it all had started. The two were always incredibly stressed, according to those around them. Raising a baby was heavily weighing on their relationship. So by the time Paul was 1 in 1977, they got a divorce. Doreen ended up getting primary custody of their son, but Mike was still heavily involved in his life. He typically spent weekends with Paul because, again, Mike had never really had a lot of consistent people in his life, people that stayed no matter what. So Paul was this one thing that he always had. And Doreen had just added herself to the list of people that left him, so his relationship with his son seemed to be the one thing that he was clinging to. During this time, Mike made it clear to everyone that he was distraught that his marriage had failed. He was described as being bitter, even more so because Doreen seemed to move on quickly and he could not wrap his head around it. Not even a year after their divorce in 1978, Doreen had met another man and started dating him. This man was Charles Erbert, and he was very successful and well-loved in the community. He owned a local carpet store, he had a home in a desirable neighborhood in the Berryessa district of San Jose. The two of them fell in absolute love, and Charles treated Paul as if he was his own. So very soon they married, and by November 26, 1979, they gave birth to their own daughter named Deanna. Mike at this point lived only 6 blocks away from the Erberts and would frequently stop by to visit with Paul. But on top of his bitter feelings toward Doreen that he made abundantly clear, he also started to question Doreen's parenting. Doreen and Charles had a pool in the backyard of their home, and unfortunately, they lost a pet due to drowning. And this, for obvious reasons, caused Mike to fear for his son. He didn't want anything to happen to Paul. So Doreen and Charles installed a fence at Mike's request to help calm his fears and also to keep Paul safe. But it seemed like Mike at this point wasn't settling for anything. He was stuck in this belief that Doreen did not care for their son. He was paranoid, he was on edge, he was constantly angry at Doreen and accusing her of being incapable of caring for Paul, despite the fact that everyone that knew Doreen knew how much she loved her children, knew that she did everything for them. So what ended up happening in February of 1980 crushed Mike entirely. That day, Mike had dropped Paul off with Doreen after a short visit. And shortly after, Paul, for whatever reason, decided to scale the pool fence before falling in and drowning. I don't know the full story. I don't know if Doreen realized Paul wasn't in the house or saw him physically go into the pool, but regardless, she went immediately to the next door neighbor, terrified to check the pool for herself, scared to see Paul's lifeless body at the bottom, which is exactly where he ended up being found. Doreen rushed Paul to the hospital where he was put on life support for 3 days. But after those 3 days, he was unfortunately pronounced dead. Doreen and Mike had lost their son. Mike had lost his best friend. Mike began to spiral after this, and in March of 1982, he filed a wrongful death suit against Doreen and Charles. He said that they had caused him immense emotional damage, and he believed that it was their direct negligence that led to Paul's death. He very specifically was blaming Doreen. But ultimately, after looking at all of the evidence, all of the information, the judge ruled that this was just a tragic accident, that all precautions had been in place and Paul found his way around them. No one did anything wrong and everyone was suffering. There was no one to blame for what happened. So the judge ultimately ruled in favor of the Erberts, and Mike was infuriated. After the hearing, Mike angrily shouted at Doreen, so Charles told him to never ever come to their house again, to stay out of their lives, because at this point, Charles was worried for their safety due to Mike's unpredictability and clear aggression toward them. It had been years of this bitterness and anger just building, and now it seemed to be boiling over. But Mike only fell into a deeper rage. He started to claim to therapists and psychiatrists that he had been the only one sad at Paul's funeral. He convinced himself that not a single other person there actually cared for Paul. It was only him. He even began to tell his coworkers that he believed it was beyond negligence at this point. He thought that Doreen purposefully let Paul go into the pool to drown. He said that she had been jealous of his relationship with their son, so she purposely didn't watch him. She purposely didn't jump into the pool to save him. He believed Doreen killed Paul, and he just became angrier and angrier watching as Doreen tried to continue moving forward in life. Doreen became pregnant with a 3rd child that was due at the end of 1984, a baby boy, which I can only guess made Mike feel like she was somehow replacing their Paul. And by October of 1984, when Doreen was 8 months pregnant, Mike had kind of the final blow, the straw that broke the camel's back. He had worked at Lockheed as a sprayer for years, and and at the start of that month, he ended up losing his position. And in order to not be completely laid off, he accepted a lower paying position, but he was far from happy with this. His coworkers said that he wasn't outright mean to them. He did his work, he was, friendly, but behind closed doors, he was pissed. He was unhappy, he didn't like the work, he felt like he was above it, and he would frequently go to his previous supervisor to complain. So at this point, Mike felt like he had lost everything. He felt he had lost his son, his marriage, his dream job, his court case. He was on the verge of snapping. This brings us to just weeks later on Halloween night. Doreen, Charles, and their 4-year-old daughter, Deanna, were preparing for a night of trick-or-treating and passing out candy in their San Jose neighborhood. Now, Doreen, as I said, was 8 months pregnant at this point, so Charles said he would take Deanna to majority of the houses while Doreen stayed home. She could, relax on the couch, pass out the candy, and then they would switch off when there were a few more houses left so that Doreen didn't entirely miss out on the experience. Doreen and Deanna ended up wrapping up trick-or-treating just before 9 p.m. They returned to the house, they turned on Halloween movies, they were passing out a bit more candy, and at around 9 p.m., Charles said he was going to head out to a store literally right down the road to grab some more beer. And he told Doreen to go ahead and close the house up for the night. It was getting late, and he didn't think anyone else would be coming. And in the 15 minutes that Charles was gone, only 15 minutes, the most heinous and sadistic crime occurred within the walls of his own home. When Charles arrived back to the house after stopping at the store, he noticed that the front door to their house was slightly open. And he found this odd because he had told Doreen to close things up for the night. But he figured that she maybe had decided to just go ahead and pass out the rest of the candy and didn't think too much into it. But when he walked inside of the entryway of their home, he slipped on something, a giant pool of blood. Charles proceeded to look around the room, and the first thing that he saw under a stool that had been holding their freshly carved jack-o'-lantern was a quiet and unmoving fetus. Charles flew into a panic, and initially he was thinking Doreen had miscarried, that something with the pregnancy had gone horribly wrong. So in this panic, he didn't really register that Doreen's severed hand was laying right beside their baby. He looked around and ultimately found Doreen laying motionless on the floor, also covered in blood. Charles frantically tried to stop her bleeding, figure out where it was coming from, but it seemed to be coming from absolutely everywhere. Every inch of everything was covered in blood. At this point, he tried to focus his efforts on finding 4-year-old Deanna, so he called out to her and she came out from a hiding place in the living room. And he told her to go into the kitchen so she didn't have to see the horrors that were sitting in the front of their home. Charles tried to no avail to reach 911, so instead he called the fire department and then also called a neighbor to come and help him with Doreen. This neighbor came over and was also under the impression that Doreen must have just lost the baby. Like, this is the thought process that everyone was at in the moment. So this neighbor scooped up Deanna to take back home with her, while Charles waited on first responders and desperately performed CPR on his wife. When police arrived to the home, they found an uncontrollable and hysterical Charles covered from head to toe in blood. They smelled alcohol on his breath, and at this point, they were fully unaware of the entirety of the situation inside. Who may be behind it? Was this accidental? Was this, homicide? They are piecing things together as the seconds tick by, and he is looking incredibly suspicious at this point, very agitated, so they decided to put him in the back of a police car. Charles was so upset at this point, they couldn't even get him to tell them his name, let alone what they were about to find in the house. So when they walked in, it was just pure chaos. As authorities walked toward the home, they noticed that there was a wolf mask lying on the front porch. And upon opening the door, they saw the blood coating the entire entryway of the home. It was an inch thick on the floor, all over the walls, the furniture. And at first, they even thought the fetus that was on the ground was a doll. One of the officers tried to alert the other officer, like, hey, watch out, there's a doll on the floor, don't step on it or slip on it. And when they looked at it further, they're like, wait a minute, this is not a doll, this is a baby. They then saw Doreen. She was clinging to life and slashed open. It was obvious that this wasn't a miscarriage. Her unborn baby had been cut from the womb, mutilated, and tossed to the side. She had been horrifically hacked at with some sort of huge weapon that cast blood clear across the room and even cut deep gashes into the ceiling. Whoever did this was infuriated with her. This was personal. Charles and Doreen's baby was pronounced dead on the scene, so this was already a homicide investigation from the start. And based on Charles being covered in blood and absolutely out of control, they worried that he was the one behind it. Maybe he was drunk and got angry. The possibilities were just endless. So Doreen was loaded into an ambulance as Charles wailed from the backseat of the cop car. He was violently kicking the windows and smashing his head against them to try to get to his wife. That would be the last time he would see her, and authorities at this point still couldn't figure out if his behavior was because of what he was witnessing or if it was a testament to what he potentially did himself. Charles was taken to the station without being able to say any sort of goodbye to his wife, and on the way to the hospital, Doreen was ultimately pronounced dead. Authorities knew before she was even loaded up and taken away that the injuries that she had did not support life. There was no way anyone could have done anything to save her. So at this point, they turned every ounce of their attention into figuring out what happened. Charles was devastated and adamant that he had no part in whatever happened to his wife and to his unborn son. He explained to the police the events of the night, that they had gone trick-or-treating, they were having a great time, and that he had been with Doreen just minutes before all of this unfolded. He said that his daughter Deanna had been at the home and was now at a neighbor's house, and he said that she likely saw exactly what happened. So back at the house, authorities continued to take in the scene to figure out what happened. They also did a sweep of the house to make sure that there were no more victims or possibly a hiding killer, and they said it looked like something out of a horror movie. They had to see this baby laying lifeless underneath this creepy jack-o'-lantern smiling over it. They couldn't understand who on earth could do something to that magnitude. And once authorities felt they had done a sufficient enough sweep of the home, they went to speak to Deanna to see if she had any information to offer. Deanna told authorities that she and her mom had been sitting watching movies when there was a knock at the door. And she said that it didn't sound like a knock from all the other trick-or-treaters. There was this harshness behind it. Doreen got up to answer the door, probably thinking that it was going to be another trick-or-treater. She was excited to hand out more candy, and instead, screaming began. Deanna said a big bad wolf was at the door, and he told her mom, quote, "I'm going to kill you." She heard her mom tell this strange man to get out of her house, and then she yelled at Deanna to hide, so that's exactly what Deanna did. She said that she tucked herself under a blanket behind the couch and then sat there as she heard her mother's brutal murder. After her mom fell silent, she heard the man start to wander around the house, and it was obvious that he was looking for her. She could see that he was wearing a wolf mask, and he was also wearing a pair of mechanic overalls that she remembered making a swishing sound as he walked around. And when he couldn't find Deanna, he eventually just yelled out to her, saying that if she told anyone what just happened, he would come back and he would kill her too. She said she was so scared to move from behind the couch that she just sat there frozen until her dad returned home just 2 or 3 minutes later. This happened so fast. There was so much horror so quickly. I cannot even begin to imagine a 4-year-old witnessing something like that, even if she didn't see it, which she said she didn't. Just hearing it, just knowing what is happening, my heart is absolutely broken for her. Authorities weren't sure what to think at this point. I mean, Deanna mentioned a big bad wolf. She also said that her dad had in fact left. So did Charles pretend to leave only to put on a costume and attack his pregnant wife? But why would he have done that? Or was this someone else entirely, but who would have so much hatred for Doreen that they would do something like this? And when they started speaking to neighbors, they got their answer. Neighbors told authorities about Mike Dennis, Doreen's ex-husband that hated her with all he had. Neighbors explained the history, the loss of Paul, their nasty divorce, the court battle that he lost, and how bitter he was in the aftermath. This led authorities to head to Mike's home just around midnight, and it was not lost on them that Mike's home was only a 6-minute walk away. When they arrived, they noticed that his truck was sitting in the driveway, and after touching the hood, they realized it was warm, as if it had been running recently, which in and of itself is not odd. But then they noticed blood. Most of the car was dirty, but the driver's side door and window appeared to have been like haphazardly wiped clean. Peering into the window, they noticed there was blood on the shift gear knob and the steering wheel. So right away, they knew that it was hugely possible Mike was involved in the horrors that happened in the Erberts' home. Lights could be seen on inside of Mike's house, so they knew someone was likely awake, and as they knocked on the door, they started to hear the sound of running water. All of the detectives said that they looked right at each other with the exact same thought in their minds. Mike was potentially getting rid of evidence. After several knocks, Mike failed to come to the door, despite the obvious movement inside. Like, he was in there, but he was pretending like police were not pounding at his door. So they ended up having to reach out to dispatch to get his phone number to call the home to get his attention. And it was still quite a few minutes after this call before Mike finally answered the door. And when he did, he appeared calm and unbothered, almost devoid of emotion entirely. He followed the officers in, and they all sat around the kitchen table. And from the get-go, they're like, okay, we've seen strange things, but like his behavior's not matching up to someone that's done something wrong. He was allowing the officers inside. They told Mike that his ex-wife, Doreen, had been brutally murdered, and with the same nonchalance in which he opened the door with, all he had to say was either, "You're kidding," or "Oh, really?" Something to that effect. Just like a half-ass, like, "Oh, wow, that's strange," kind of response. Mike ended up agreeing to let the officers do a quick search of his home, so again, it seemed he was being cooperative, but when he went to sign the consent papers, they noticed yet another red flag. Mike was trying to sign the papers with his left hand, and the officers watching him do this, and he is not able to do so. Like, he cannot sign the papers. And so the officer asked him, "Are you left-handed or right-handed? Because something is going on here." And Mike ends up admitting that he wasn't left-handed. He was actually right-handed, and he finally brings his right hand into full view. The entire hand, down to each finger, was tightly wrapped in gauze. And the gauze was so saturated in fresh blood that they were waiting for it to start dripping onto the table. Mike proceeded to explain to the officers that it was just a silly accident that caused that injury. He said he had been carving a pumpkin earlier on that night, and he threw the knife up in the air for fun and accidentally grabbed the blade instead of the handle. But police at this point were not buying it. Too many strange things were stacking up. So at this point, Mike was escorted upstairs to get his ID from his bedroom. They needed to, just confirm identity, things like that. And it was at this point they noticed his demeanor change, because it was just Mike and Detective Jamie Saldivar going by themselves up to the bedroom. And so Detective Saldivar was following him up the stairs, and all of a sudden, Mike turned to stare at him. Detective Saldivar said, quote, "He turns and looks over his shoulder, and he looks at me with this lifeless, demonic stare." It was enough to scare the crap out of Detective Saldivar that he pulled his weapon and held it down at his side, just waiting for Mike to do something. And that feeling continued into Mike's room. As they entered, Mike was going to where he said his ID was being kept, but he kept glancing over his shoulder at the headboard of his bed. And after a few times of doing this, Detective Saldivar said, "Forget this," and placed himself in the middle so that he wasn't able to get there. And it was at this moment that he noticed that there was a shoulder holster with a loaded .357 Magnum hanging there. And he kind of put two and two together and felt that Mike had either been contemplating grabbing the gun to shoot himself, or he was planning on shooting at the officers. This was becoming a dangerous situation, and someone innocent that just accidentally cut themselves carving a pumpkin, that had nothing to do with a brutal murder, likely wasn't going to be acting this way. The short search started to be conducted in Mike's home, and pretty much immediately they discovered more damning evidence. There were drops of blood found leading to the washer in Mike's garage, but whatever clothing had been put inside, because that's exactly what looked like happened, had since been removed. They also found more blood in the kitchen and bloody bandages in the bathroom. On his bed was a pair of bloody jeans, and his car keys were covered in blood as well. A closer inspection of his truck showed even more blood was also on the handle of the door, it was on the radio, it was on the driver's seat, and on the floorboard under the gas pedal. They also found blood on the ignition switch and on a piece of rope in the back of the truck. And so what did he do? Slice his hand open on the pumpkin and then just decide to go for a joyride, and then, did some laundry and all of these things while his hand is just oozing blood. It was not adding up. They then noticed blood going from the garage of Mike's home past the trash cans and heading down the road. And they followed it like at least 100 yards. And it was at this point that they started to see flashing lights scanning an area a few hundred yards away. And they're like, what on earth are these flashlights? It was CSI from the other house. They had been following blood from Doreen's door that led down the road, across a pedestrian bridge, and straight to Mike's house. That is a clear trail connecting the two that night. So Mike was immediately arrested and taken in for questioning. At this point, authorities still weren't convinced Charles wasn't somehow involved because of his behavior, but Mike was starting to look like a very likely suspect. They had been able to confirm through witnesses and surveillance that Charles had in fact gone to the store during the time of the murders, but that didn't rule out him paying a hitman or maybe having an accomplice of any sort. Heck, maybe Mike could have been his accomplice. They still just could not rule him out entirely. But it didn't take long for evidence to really just start piling up one particular way. At around 2:30 a.m. on November 1st, Mike was interviewed formally, and he told police that he'd come home from work that day at around 4 p.m. and he hadn't left his house since. He said that the most he did was walk around his property bored because not a lot of kids came to his house for candy. He claimed that he ate dinner with his mom, who lived in a detached apartment on his property, at around 6 or 6:30, and then she went back to her apartment at around 8:15. He maintained his calm demeanor and denied any involvement in whatever happened to Doreen. So authorities asked him to describe any Halloween costumes he had, since Deanna described a big bad wolf, and that wolf mask was found right at the scene of the crime. Mike admitted that he loved Halloween. He said that he typically went to parties and he had several costumes, but he never described a wolf, and he had no plans to attend a Halloween party that night. Over the next few days, they were finally able to rule out that Charles was involved, and so they turned all of their attention just to Mike. They started interviewing neighbors, and not just the Erberts' neighborhood, but Mike's neighborhood as well, to try to connect him possibly in the area. Several neighbors living in the Erberts' neighborhood claimed that they saw a full-grown man in a wolf costume standing in the street staring at the Erberts' home at around 7 p.m., which was 2 hours before the attack even occurred, and really indicates a bit of premeditation happening here. Two other trick-or-treaters saw a man wearing overalls and a mask walking away from the Erberts' home toward the pedestrian path just after 9 p.m., and this matches the blood trail found and the timing that Mike potentially would have been walking back to his house. And they claim that the man was carrying a heavy grocery bag with him. So this person who attacked Doreen had been sitting and watching and waiting for the perfect moment. It seems that they noticed right when Charles left and saw that as their opportunity. When officers interviewed Mike's neighbors, they also had something interesting to say. Mike had taken misdelivered mail to a neighbor of his around 6:30 p.m. that night, so just after he had dinner with his mom. But despite telling authorities he had no plans that night, that he never left, he told his neighbor he had plans to go to a Halloween party. It seemed at this point like he was maybe trying to create an alibi. Now, unfortunately, after 48 hours, they had no choice but to release Mike. They either had to bring forward charges in that amount of time, or they couldn't legally hold him. And the DA ruled they simply didn't have sufficient evidence, so he was let go. But authorities did not give up. And the autopsy report came back showing just how horrific the murder had been. Dr. John Hauser found that Doreen had died from multiple chopping wounds that resulted in exsanguination, or in layman's terms, she slowly bled to death. He believed that the wounds had been inflicted by a sword-like instrument, which made sense because the first thing authorities noticed was that whoever did this and was like hacking when the weapon came back up, I mean, it cut clear into the drywall of the ceiling. Doreen was covered head to toe in cuts and gashes. Some blows from the weapon had been so hard that it fractured her skull and penetrated her brain. Her humerus had been severed, forceful stab wounds had fractured her femur, and she had a 9-inch wound in her abdomen where the attacker had cut her baby from her. And that is just a small example of Doreen's injuries. There was so much more than that, and she survived it for at least 30 minutes. With this information, they conducted a second search of Mike's home. And at this point, they found some pretty terrifying evidence. Authorities found packaging and a receipt for an 18-inch Stanley machete that Mike had recently purchased. The exact kind of weapon that could have done that level of damage to Doreen and her baby, and left those gashes in the ceiling and the walls. And a trip to the convenience store that it was purchased from confirmed that it was Mike himself that bought it. Authorities then ventured into his garage, where they made probably one of the most scary discoveries. They found 2 handmade caskets and a map of the San Francisco Bay Area. One of the caskets was smaller than the other and seemed to almost exactly match the heights of both Charles and Doreen. They then found hand-stitched body bags inside of these caskets, as well as weights. As if what happened to Doreen and her baby wasn't already horrific enough, this suggested that there had at one point been another plan in place that also had Charles as a target. And as authorities were waiting for blood evidence to come back, they continued digging into Mike's life and possible connections to the crime. They had taken his clothing from him during his first arrest the night of the murders, which, by the way, the clothing had blood all over it, and they found a little black book in his pocket. They began reaching out to several people in the book to see if they had any helpful information. They learned more about Mike's troubled past and also learned that he had lied about his Halloween costumes. A woman they reached out to had been relatively close to Mike and said that just the year before, they had attended a Halloween party together, and she said that Mike was wearing a wolf costume. She described the mask, and they knew right away it was the exact same one they had found on the Erberts' doorsteps. The mask was pretty identifiable because I feel like most Halloween wolf masks are going to be of the very scary variety, but this was more of like a cheesy, cartoonish style wolf mask. And that is exactly what this woman described. And not just that, she said several pictures had been taken that night, and she knew for a fact one had been taken of her and Mike in this costume. Authorities managed to track this picture down and went to retrieve it, and sure enough, it was what they believed to be Mike in the exact same mask found at the scene, and the exact same mask described by several witnesses in the neighborhood that night. So they confronted Mike with this new evidence, thinking at this point, he's probably just going to crack. He's going to know they have enough, and he might as well just tell them what happened. But he continued to deny everything. Mike even went as far as saying they had no way to prove it was him under the mask, that picture was of someone else, but authorities knew there was definitely a way to prove it. So a third search warrant was obtained for Mike's home, and it only took minutes for them to locate the clothing that he had been wearing in the picture, neatly folded and hanging in his closet. Without a doubt, that had been Mike Dennis. This evidence piling up was more and more compelling, and they knew they were getting closer to an arrest. And then the blood evidence came back, and there was little room for doubt at this point. DNA testing didn't exist at this point. I think it was actually just being developed, but they could still type the blood to at least narrow things down. Blood samples had been taken from both the crime scene and Mike's home, and both of them were tested. Mike's blood type was found commingled with Doreen's blood type at the Erbert home, and Doreen's blood type was found at Mike's home. They had their killer. There was no way to get around this. So for a second time, on November 5th, 1984, Mike Dennis was arrested. And this time, he was charged with first and second degree murder regarding the deaths of Doreen and her unborn baby boy. Now, Mike didn't go to trial for 4 years, and the entire time he maintained his innocence, entering a plea of not guilty. It wasn't until the very last minute that this all changed. And I think it was because his attorneys knew their only hope at getting out of this was by changing their plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense began to claim that Mike had been driven mad that Halloween night. Since his son's death, he had been suffering from delusions and depressions, which was confirmed by, therapists, psychiatrists, friends, family. And when he watched all of these other kids out trick-or-treating, something in him snapped. They said that he had several recent stressors in life, like losing his job, that made him just completely lose touch with reality. So I guess he went to act out his revenge on who he thought took his son from him. And the real story of what happened started to come to light. Mike had seen several psychiatrists and therapists over the last several years, and they all seemed to echo the same thing. Mike had fixated on Doreen and Charles to relieve his own guilt over Paul's death. Psychiatrists testified that he had started to experience paranoid delusions when Paul died that only intensified with time. Just like he had admitted to friends, he also admitted to specialists that he believed Doreen purposely killed their son, and he also admitted that he had started to fantasize about, in turn, killing both Doreen and Charles. And that is where those caskets they found in his garage came into play. Mike admitted that he had thought about several different ways to kill them over that span of time after the civil suit. This had been a constant thought going on in his mind, and he had built those coffins for the two of them. He planned to attack them both, but keep them alive, and then he was going to place them in the body bags and in the caskets, and then throw them alive into the ocean at the San Mateo Bridge to show them what it was like to drown like Paul had. But for whatever reason, I guess him snapping, seeing the children on Halloween, he decided to act then instead, and he solely targeted Doreen. He claimed to psychiatrists that he didn't know Doreen was pregnant, and if he had, he wouldn't have attacked her, but the prosecution and many others argued that that was a load of absolute crap. Several of Mike's family members knew that she was pregnant, so the chances that he didn't were low. It was like he was trying to at least seem not as depraved as he was, but it really wasn't working out for him. He had been watching the house for hours, according to witnesses, so he had to have seen her going in and out and trick-or-treating with her daughter. Doreen was 5'1", and everyone had been joking about how huge she was nearing her due date. They were talking about how wide. I mean, you can see pictures, okay? She was a very pregnant woman. But the defense continued to argue that he didn't know because he was in a frenzied, unstable state of mind. Psychiatrists couldn't seem to agree, however, if his mental state really prevented him from knowing what he was doing at the time. Some diagnosed him with delusion disorder, while others said that he fully knew what he was doing, and the evidence pointed to long-term premeditation. I mean, he had even admitted to psychiatrists that he had been fantasizing about their deaths for a very long time. It took him a while to build 2 caskets, to hand sew together 2 body bags, to plot out the best place to dump their bodies. I mean, and there's no telling if he had other plans on top of that. This was not a last-minute rash decision. This had been something that he wanted to do for a very, very long time. So that night, he put on his mask, he put on his overalls, walked over to his ex-wife's home, and brutally murdered her and her unborn son. He had, I believe, cut out the uterus. I mean, he so purposefully made sure to take this baby out of Doreen, and even went as far as mutilating the baby itself. Now, could that have accidentally happened while he was trying to attack Doreen? Maybe, but I mean, you don't just accidentally surgically remove a child from the womb. I don't know if he ever admitted it, but it's also likely that he was fully intending on harming Deanna as well. He was walking around trying to find her. There's no telling what he would have done to her, and I'm so glad she managed to hide herself the way that she did. The prosecution believed that the mask ended up being thrown off because Mike wore glasses and there were only tiny little pinholes for him to look through the mask in, so he probably started to struggle to see, so he likely tossed the mask off and then left. But they believe that after he walked home, he threw everything that was covered in blood, whatever was in that bag, into the back of his truck, and then he went and disposed of it before coming home and starting to clean up before police arrived. Ultimately, Mike was convicted of both first and second degree murder, and he was sentenced to death using the gas chamber for what he did. But as of 2023, Mike is still sitting in San Quentin. After his sentencing, and obviously before his scheduled execution date, California got rid of the death penalty, and everyone that was currently on death row at the time had their sentences changed to life in prison. So he will never be facing the death penalty that he was originally sentenced to. I've seen Doreen's family, including Charles and Deanna, have made it known that they support the death penalty and wish that it had been enforced in their case. But as the years have passed, as they have tried to work through this trauma and move forward, they have ultimately forgiven Mike. Deanna, who's now an adult with her own family, stated, quote, "I can understand him losing a child. I get that, but you took something from me too. You took something big. You took my mom, you destroyed our family, and I won't forget that. But I do forgive him for it, because for my own sanity, I don't want to be angry anymore." Mike's actions plagued their lives for so long. Mike's constant anger plagued their lives for so long. They didn't want to just repeat that in their own lives. So they have since pushed to take their lives back. Deanna's even pushed to make Halloween an enjoyable holiday for herself and her family, just to prove to him that ultimately he didn't win. I don't know if Mike has ever apologized. I don't know if he's ever accepted responsibility for what he did. He was obviously struggling mentally, and most psychiatrists agree that he was not given adequate help when he first went to see a professional after his son's death. But he still committed one of the most heinous acts ever seen. He did something so barbaric and so awful. And he took advantage of Halloween and his mask and anonymity to act out his disgusting plan. Doreen was only 31 years old. She was so excited to welcome a second baby. And not just that, this was a rainbow baby. She had suffered several miscarriages in the past year, and they were so excited to have a healthy pregnancy. And Mike took that from not just her, but from Charles, from Deanna. This was such a tragic and senseless crime, and it's scary because it feels like there were a lot of different points where something more serious should have been done with Mike to help deal with his mental health, to prevent him from continuing this spiral to the point where he had an absolute break. One of the scariest parts of the story is that everyone that testified and came up with words about Mike to say what he was like as a person, their relationship with him, no one seemed to have anything bad to say. They said he was a great guy, he was really nice, but they did know that he was sad, that he seemed depressed, that he held this hatred for Doreen. And that's what makes crimes like these so scary, because I feel like the entirety of my channel is about trying to prevent crime, understanding it, learning how people get to this point, learning the warning signs. And while there were definitely lots of warning signs here, I feel like no one ever could have guessed that he would be capable of that kind of brutal attack on his ex-wife and her unborn baby, especially because everyone saw how horribly the loss of Paul affected him. Who was going to believe that he would ever purposely inflict that kind of unimaginable pain on someone else's baby? As a person that really relies and is comforted by patterns to understand why these things happen, these cases where someone just snaps absolutely terrify me. But hopefully this leaves some of you guys with some sort of heightened awareness. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Doreen's story. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video.